24, sound roll 13 on Billy Rowe.
Okay. First, let's talk about even before he came to New York and before you met him. Tell me how folks, yourself especially, started to hear about Joe Louis. What were you starting to hear out in the before you even came to New York?
Well, the word was out that Joe Louis was the sensation that people were beginning to hear about, that he'd broken down the headline spaces in the daily newspapers and was being quoted and talked about. And everybody says, who is this fellow? Gosh, wow, wow. You know, everybody wanted to hear about, not only just hear about him, but they wanted to see Joe Louis. But those weren't the days when you could jump on a train or a plane and go out to see a fight, because it was kind of in the, I think the Depression was on, I believe, then, and things weren't that easy. But it's very fast, Joe, the name itself turned out to be, we got the feeling that here at last, on top of Jack Johnson, you know, that here was the last was a fighter with pride and purpose.
What was it about him that people were hearing? What I mean,
his manner of, it seemed that the press gave his manner of fighting a whole different outlay than it ordinarily would be for prize fighters, because prize fighters were not that great in people's minds in that division, the heavyweight champion division. And they were all seemed to be very kind to Joe Louis, but it turned out that they weren't kind to Joe Louis. They were really stating facts, because there was this nice fella, and there was this fella with strength, and there was this fella who was going into rings and knocking people out. So everybody in New York looked forward to seeing this Herculean character who suddenly stepped into the ring and started fighting.
great. How did the white folks feel about it?
Well, the white sport fans, it seemed that those that we were in contact with had the same feeling that fighting was something that people enjoyed or liked to see. Why, I don't know. And that had come along at that time, and they weren't any of those that you came in contact with that you got the feeling that, hey, here's a guy who's a woman or a person who's prejudiced. The person either was for or against fighters, regardless of what their color was, or regardless of what thing they were. That's the feeling we got at that moment. Things seemed to sort of coming together. Harlem itself, of course, was a real great place in those days. It was the mecca of all of us who sooner or later we all wanted to come to New York.
Excuse me. Can you look at me a little bit more when you talk?
Camera roll 24.
Before Joe Louis came on the scene, at that time in the Depression, people were very wary of black boxers because of Jack Johnson, and we'll talk about Jack Johnson in the film, so you don't have to tell me about him.
Okay.
But what was it about Joe Louis that changed all that?
Well, there seemed to be, in my feeling about Joe, he seemed to be a nice person. He wasn't boring. He didn't bore you with stories, or he didn't run off doing funny things. He had an idea. All the things he wanted to do, he had an idea, and he'd say to somebody, "This is what you're going to do." And that's how we became such good friends, I presume, because having been with the Pittsburgh Courier this long length of time at that point, and sort of, as they used to call me, the colored Walter Winchell. Well, Joe didn't like that, you know, and he said, "He's not the colored Walter Winchell. He's Billy Rowe." And people would say that when he was going, we'd go around together all the time. I'd meet him. And so he said, "You don't want to go run around with this guy." He said, "This guy is a cardiomist he writes you up, you know." He said, "Well, that's why I'm going around with him, because he couldn't write me up without him writing himself up." So he was that kind of a person, just a nice, easygoing person.
Do you know much about, can you tell me about Chappie and Roxborough and Black? I mean, wasn't it unusual for a fighter like that to have an all-black management team?
By all means, that in itself was history.
Can you tell me about, can you start that sentence over again?
That of course is history, and they were so they were quite unusual themselves. They were not exactly like managers usually are. Joe Louis was their main eye thing, their eye, their arms, whatever. Everything was for Joe Louis, and Joe realized that, and Joe, I think he felt it.
But how was it for the rest of the world that here was this black fighter and he had black managers? I mean, was that odd? Was that a different kind of thing?
No, I think it brought on a kind of respect for him that the others.
You have to again. Please start out by saying if they have a black, that by having all black management, whatever.
Yeah, by having all black managers, naturally, it sort of even gave us another feeling. This to us was the greatest thing that ever happened, black managers, because Madison Square Garden and the rest of the people always controlled all that with all the fighters, white or black. And for Joe Louis to come into town and just the other way around, it was a real great feeling for us. We felt that we had really become a part of the whole deal.
Great, great. What kind of things did Joe Louis? He's a big hero for a lot of people. What kind of things did he do? Specific things, and you've told me about it. But let's stay in the 30s. What kinds of things did he do to kind of overcome discrimination?
Well, Joe Louis, in his battle against discrimination, was carried deep into the whole system because the fact that he was this great fighter that everybody wanted to see. So Joe could speak out and Joe could make certain demands by just being Joe Louis. He didn't have to. He was not a fighting, outspoken person. He was just there. You got that feeling. Both white and black got that feeling. And of course, in those days, the word was colored, and it wasn't a matter of being black or saying that you were black. And it's.
So what kind of things did he do?
Well,
and again, can you look at me a little bit more when you
yeah, Joe Louis, to me and most people, of course, was a silent warrior. He would go right to the top of whatever was necessary to make changes. If it had to do with boxing, he would go to the boxing promoters and he would make the changes. There were cases quite some time after he got to be the champion and became Joe Louis, where he wanted to break down discrimination in golf. And he didn't go beating around the bush.
Again, we have to talk about the 30s. But you told me stuff. You just told me earlier
that
about going to hotels and things like that. Those are the kinds of incidents I'm talking about. The quiet stuff. So can we start again and say just some of the things Joe would do to break down discrimination, just in his own world?
Well, for instance, Joe Louis was, he was always invited to the finest hotels in America, but Joe would not accept lodging at a hotel if that hotel discriminated against. If I couldn't get a room in that hotel the next day by myself, he would not accept the room that night from management because he was Joe Louis. And I suppose it got around. People, they began to talk about it, and that's how he did that particular situation, took care of that one.
You told me once in a previous conversation, you said that you felt like Joe, and again I'm talking about the Depression, that Joe Louis fit the times. What did you mean by that? What does that mean? Well,
the Depression was on, and Joe was getting a salary that they quoted in the papers for fighting, and how much he got for knocking somebody out was a big thing, and we'd never heard of that kind of money before. And he'd pass out dollars to people, to guys on the street who would beg him for a cup of coffee or something like that. And there were times when he didn't have money in his pocket, so he would take it out of his friend's pocket. He'd always give it back to us, though.
Great. Why do you think Joe was such a big hero for black people? What was it about him? I mean, and we've talked about him being quiet and dignified, but what with all the heroes that there were in society, in black society, why Joe Louis? Why a boxer?
Well, I don't think it just because he was a boxer. I think that it was because of Joe Louis, just being Joe Louis. He was strange. He was a massive person as far as writing was concerned, and as far as people talking about him on radio and television, which did a lot on him those days, which was quite different from before. He was still very simple. You know, he would still shake your hand. He would shake the hand of a guy in the gutter as quick as he would shake the hands of a person who was coming out of a major airplane situation. And I think that's
but
where he
people in the
lived.
street, people in the South, people didn't know about that. Why did they sit there listening to their radios? What was it that kept them glued to their radios for a Joe Louis fight?
Because the people who didn't look at television or didn't have television, but they all read. They read the Pittsburgh Courier, they read the Afro-American, they read the Chicago Defender, and they read Ebony magazines and things. So those things, they got the message, and they added to it because there was a time when you felt that you wanted to feel good, and Joe Louis made us feel good.
Okay. When he finally came to New York, he fought.
Let's change magazines.
Okay.
Take 3. Change camera.
Tell me what the reaction in Harlem was when they heard about Mussolini in Ethiopia. And even though it was thousands of miles away, it seems to me people took it very personally. What was that about? Tell me about Harlem when they heard about that.
Well, as far as Harlem and Ethiopia is concerned, it suddenly gave us an understanding of, began to know about ourselves, where we came from, and the pride in the fact that here was a gentleman who was the head of a nation, and you never had that opportunity too much before. So, and I think the whole country itself was in awe about Ethiopia, and it just rubbed off on us naturally. We all felt very proud about that.
Yeah, but when Hitler marched on, Mussolini marched on him, how did people feel about it then? This very powerful white nation marching on this.
Well, when Mussolini went into Ethiopia, naturally, a number of us was ready to go, put on our uniforms, grab our guns, you see. And it brought Mussolini into America, to black America, with a completely different attitude that was for him all along. Before that time, and as far as it was concerned, with Ethiopia was devastating, mentally devastating.
So when Joe came to New York, he fought an Italian, just about the same time, Primo Carnera, the Italian giant. So here's this black man fighting this Italian. Did the people in Harlem, did the black folks, did they see a significance in that related to this Ethiopia thing?
I couldn't really frankly say yes or no to that particular statement. I know that they were pulling for Joe Louis, so you automatically assume, particularly our newspaper guys, we assumed that they were for Joe Louis because it was Joe Louis, not because he was fighting a person who had to do with a war against a nation which had against Ethiopia.
Okay. Do you remember that fight? Did you go to that fight?
Oh, yeah, that was the first one I think that I went to, or it might have been the first one, because I was asked to take the names of people by the Pittsburgh Courier that I was working for at that point, to take the names of the people who were coming in from out of town to the fight. In fact, the Pittsburgh, actually, that got me my job. It was suddenly made permanent now because I was supposed to know everybody. And when I told Joe, I said, I got to talk to you after the fight. He said, well, come to the dressing room. I said, I don't know how they're going to let me in. He said, just tell them that you got the okay from me. And he laughed. And so enough, and from then on, it worked out. We became real friendly behind all that.
Do you remember the fight itself?
The fight with Canera?
Yeah.
Oh yes, I remember the fight itself because the feeling was that there was a great chance for this man beating Joe because he was big and strong and he talked a lot and what have you. And the streets, everybody was waiting to see what happened. And of course, when Joe won, then we sort of marched almost like a practical march down 7th Avenue almost, they said. But we would never let Joe get into that atmosphere, despite the fact that there wasn't a feeling that anybody was going to harm Joe Louis. But you never know what could happen. So when I looked around for the automobile, he was gone.
What was the reaction in Harlem after he won?
Oh wow, it was a holiday.
Okay. Did you know his family very well? Did you know his family, his mother, his sisters?
Yeah, I knew them pretty
What kind of
good.
background did Joe Louis come from?
A real Southern type, a real family Southern type thing. I always had that feeling, and it was just complete love and understanding in that family. There was no, I don't recall any antagonism at any time. It was just something warm. I have a picture of her which I'll show you. And she was such a nice lady.
Were they afraid for him? Were they nervous about him fighting? Like when they went in the ring against Carnera, it was like this great big giant guy, and there's Joe. How did they feel about him? Were they afraid he'd get hurt?
I doubt that seriously. I think that everybody had a feeling, except his mother, had a feeling that Joe was going to win the fight. I always felt that she had a certain fear because I don't ever recall seeing her at a fight.
Can you say that again and say his mother? Because we don't know who you're talking about.
Well, in fact, I don't ever recall seeing his mother at a fight. Now, she might have been to one, but I've never seen her at one. In fact, I don't ever remember, I've never seen her at the training camp. But she loved her boy.
Okay. Now tell me you've told me a lot about that first Schmeling fight and what was going on at the training camp and all that sort of thing. Tell me, there was a different feeling about that one. Tell me about that.
Yeah.
Actually, ultimately, you ended up getting thrown out of camp, right? So tell us about what was going on there before that first Schmeling fight and what.
Well, I think that just to start with now, let me tell you that we all believe, a lot of us believe, and I certainly believe, that the Schmeling fight was the best thing that ever happened to Joe Louis. It made Joe Louis return to being Joe Louis, the kind of Joe Louis he was, because originally he was under the impression that this was going to be a knockover. There's no problem. I could knock this guy out and so on down the line. Even changed his training camp, which of course was different from what we expected, even with his trainer wanted, I understand. And he was kind of fooling around, you know. Joe was never an outlandish guy, and never really that type of that flamboyant person. But then he began to feel that way. And we talked to him about it, and he told me that, you know, you don't have to be here, you know. So I left, and I went up, way up your neighborhood, and coming back, when the fight was on and he got whipped, I said, good for him, because I made a bet that he was going to lose this fight.
Can you start over and tell me in more detail? Go back and tell me about where you were when you heard that fight. Tell me, were you in the car? Were you at home? Where were you when you heard that fight? And tell me what you were thinking when you were listening to that fight.
Well, when I would listen to that fight, I was.
When you listened to which fight?
When I was listening to the Joe Louis battle with.
Excuse me, you're gonna have to look up and.
I'm trying to. I got a little.
You want to take a break? Stop. Let's.
Yeah, because I got a little.
Would you like to take a break?
Yeah, I got a little screwed up on that.
Okay, so now go back and tell me a little bit more about Joe's attitude and how he'd won all those fights in the training camp before the first Schmeling fight. What he was feeling, what he thought he was going to do.
Actually, I believe that at that stage of his life, Joe really believed that he was invincible. And there wasn't anybody that could beat him, you see. And so he did a number of things that his trainer did not want him to do. In fact, he wanted to train, almost like training himself. He would change the camp and everything. And this was devastating to all of us. We would say things to him, and he would then say, "I'm the fighter. You know, you don't have to be here." See? So I said, "Well, I'll get out of here." He said, "Well, okay." You want me? He even asked me if he wanted me to buy some gas. I always remember that. And it went on. So when the fight was scheduled, and I did not have a ticket to go to the fight, and I wasn't going to ask him for a ticket, like as usual. And so we went. I think we wound up in the Bluffs or someplace. My wife and I went, because we were driving back during the fight. And so of course it happened to him. He got knocked out. And I had made a bet on him even. I had bet on a friend of mine about a shirt. So I won this shirt, but I've never worn it, by the way.
Well, you have to go back and tell me again, because it's not clear to me who you bet on.
I bet against Joe. I bet that he was going to lose because of the way he was acting and what have you. And I never would. I bet a shirt, never worn it. In fact, I don't think I might have gotten that shirt because it was the saddest day that ever happened to us who were on Joe's team. Harlem itself was, as you know, you probably recall, if you were around my age, and you'll find out that there was great sadness within the community. But it was still the best thing that ever happened to Joe Louis because he came back to being Joe Louis again. And I went down to the hotel to see him, and his jaw was all swollen out. He says, well, you won the fight. I said, I wasn't in there fighting. Behind that, he says, well, come on in if you're going to come in. If you're not, I'm going to close the door because I'm going to bed.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Let's change.
We ready to open?
Yeah, we have like 10 feet left. Change camera 26, channel 14, take 5.
Now I want to talk about the championship. When he won the championship, what was the feeling in the community? But how did he feel? Because he had been pretty humiliated by Max Schmeling. So was there, even though he was champion, was there kind of a taint to it? Was there? Tell me about that. First, tell me about that. When he became champion. What the?
Well, actually, I got the feeling that the most of the people felt sorry for Joe Louis rather than anything else because
about what? So you have to place me in time. I don't know what you're talking about.
Him winning the championship didn't really rub off on everybody because it didn't rub off on him. Joe never felt that he was a champion after that fight. He wanted to get back to Schmeling and prove that he was a champion. And it rubbed off on all of us. We all began, particularly those of us who were close to Joe Louis, we all could say, yeah, he's right about that. He's got to beat this guy before he becomes a champion, because Schmeling was saying things and Hitler was saying things and all.
Can we cut for a second?
Yes.
Sorry. There's something from
Yeah, start
Back,
with that
please.
part.
Take 6.
Okay, so when he...
Yeah, when Joe became champion out there in Chicago, everybody, we felt good that he did, and the group of us raised a lot of saying, it was hoopla, ha ha ha, happy, happy, happy. But then Joe came on the scene, and Joe said he didn't feel it. He didn't feel like the champion, and because he wouldn't feel like the champion until he had the return match with Max Schmeling. And that, we all accepted that. And we went along with Joe on that to keep people from saying that he was some sort of a paper champion or something or what. And there were those who believed that, he wasn't really, we felt that he wasn't really the champion because of this. He had been beaten. And and he had been and was the kind of person that we believed in. If he said it, it was the gospel, you see. So it wasn't a saying, oh well, he is a champion anyway. So nope, this is okay. So we all kept waiting for the return match.
And so when the return match came, what was his feeling? How did he approach that return match? Then when he
Well, Joe approached that. He was almost a silent type. If you recall, Joe was a silent heavyweight champion. He wasn't a bragging one or anything like that. And this, he accepted it. It appeared that here's a man with a job to do, and he's going to do it. You see, and that's the way it went along. Schmeling was still the top dog and on top of everything, so to speak. I mean, in Europe and even here. If there were any bigots around, there seemed to be very few bigots around when Joe Louis was a heavyweight champion of the world. They all felt that Schmeling had done his job. The good.
Wait a second. What I want to know is Joe. I mean, if he didn't feel like he was a champion, when he trained for the second Schmeling fight, how was it different from the first one? How did he go at it? Was he obsessed? Was he angry? Was he? Tell me about what Joe's state of mind was going into that second fight?
Joe felt he was facing a purpose. He had a purpose. He had something to do. He said he was going to do it, and he gave all.
Now you have to start over and tell me he was going to do what? Because again, they haven't.
That he was going to retain. He was going to get back the championship. As far as he was concerned, he wasn't a champion. He needed to get it back from Smelling, although he was the champion, as you can recall. But that's the kind of person he was. He was extremely honest, and emotionally and vocally. He was an honest person. You didn't. If Joe said it to you, that was it. And that's what everybody was sort of waiting for, and that's what the Harlemites, so to speak, all over the world were looking forward to. They were looking forward to Joe Louis retaining a championship, or to really putting the proper feeling and the proper light on the championship, which he, of course, owned.
So what did he do to Max Schmeling?
I think he beat him.
No. But tell me, when he got in the ring with Max Schmeling, what was his?
When he got in the ring and the bell rang, it was all business. He went right at him, and as you know exactly what happened, he knocked him out so fast that it was unbelievable that the fight was over. And then Harlemites, and we all were singing, Joe Louis is a champion.
Great. You once said to me that Joe Louis was a quiet revolutionary. What did you mean by that?
Joe Louis was a quiet revolutionary because he got involved mentally with whatever was happening that was discriminatory. Joe attempted to find some way and some reason to eliminate it. He didn't make a noise about it, and it didn't appear in the newspapers. And he would say to me, "Don't write that up now." And I would never write it up, what he was doing. You know, if he had to talk to the president about something, it was a terrific scoop to let go, but you had to let it go, because that's the kind of person he was. And that's why I always I called him and thought of him as a quiet revolutionary.
But what things would he do as a quiet revolutionary?
Well, he would never, for instance, I know he would never live in a hotel that he was invited to the biggest hotels, of course. But if the next day a black American could not go to that hotel and get a room, Joe Louis would not accept it, you see. And we stayed in hotels, black-owned hotels. There were a number of black-owned hotels in those days, and in Chicago and in St. Louis. And they were not as fancy, but they were nice hotels, and that's where we all stayed.
You once told me what Joe's idea of being rich is. What was Joe's idea of being rich?
Joe's idea of being rich was really a sort of a strange one. He said, in order to be a real rich person, he says, I want to be able, so all I have to do is get on the train, because it was a train those days. We didn't jump on the airplanes that much. I want to get on the plane and not pack a bag, because when my clothes would be wherever I am going. If we're going to California, he wanted to have enough clothes in California so he could just go change his clothes. Chicago, Florida, wherever he was going, he never liked packing a bag. And his idea of being rich was never having to pack a bag, but always have your clothes waiting for you when you got where you were going.
Great.
Can you cut for a second?
Yes, we go.
Great.
Mark it, please.
Take 7.
Great. Okay, so tell me about this business about Joe being a symbol against the Nazis. And this is before the war, but things were building up, and he fought Schmeling, and Schmeling was Hitler's man. Tell me about that.
Are you ready for that?
I'm ready.
Well, I don't know. I can honestly say that I know that that's where Joe felt. I'm not. I know that's the way the media felt. The media was exposing this kind of feeling, but I really never discussed it with him.
Well, that's what I want to talk about. The media, not Joe this time. How was the media? This second Schmeling fight, this propaganda. What kind of hype were they putting out?
Oh, it was the greatest. It was a great American had won for America, and hooray, hooray, hooray. But of course, the media was always kind to Joe Louis. There was just something about this man that you couldn't help but like him. You know, he wasn't a guy that you could have all them other kind of funny feelings about. You see. And as a result, he never got into any real problems. But as I said, he would use that. He would use them friends who thought he was a great guy to make them change certain things that were bad. Because when he went into the service, after all, or your question, of course, but when he went into the service, we went to the camp in a limousine and got out of.
I'm sorry, we have little film if we can't talk about the service.
Oh, sorry about
so,
that.
I know you want to, but we can't talk about that. But you know, I want to talk about John Roxborough again, and the kind of situation he set up to make it so that Joe Louis could become champion. What this black management team? I'm still curious about that. What kind of a guy was John Roxborough, and what did they do to make Joe's career?
Well, they got him around the right people, I believe.
Who's that? You gotta tell me the names. 'Cause I
Well,
don't hear my
the
question.
owner of the Madison, the guy promoted for the Madison Square Garden, that guy, isn't it? Time has sort of knocked him out of Mike Jacobs. Mike Jacobs was a real, nice person, kind of person. Joe Louis loved him, and I don't know how much problem he had with his management, but he would give Joe anything Joe wanted, and but his management team was perhaps one of the greatest in America, whether it was white or black. They knew exactly what to do. They would keep, and they kept people away from Joe. They would have kept me away from Joe, but Joe rescinded that only because I think I told you the story about a friend of mine with a hat store. And so I figured it was a good way for this friend of mine to get his picture in the paper by giving Joe Louis a hat. So he gave me the hat to give to Joe Louis when I go to deliver it to him. Joe was here then on a vaudeville sort of a run at the Harlem Opera House. And when I went there to give him the hat, and I told the man, that I'd like to see Joe Louis. He said, "You can't see Joe." I said, "But I'm a newspaper guy." "Not right now." John and them said no. And then finally I said, "Well, I got a present for him." So Joe heard that, and Joe says, "Well, let him in." He says, "He's the only person in New York that wanted to give me something for nothing." And I think that's how we became friends.
Okay, great. You got that?
No, you know.
Okay, right. Okay. All right, so that's a cut. That's a wrap. Thank you.
Great, thanks.